January 20th, 1996. The day began like any other in Varginha, a quiet farming town in the hills of southeastern Brazil. Families prepared breakfast. Shop owners unlocked their doors. Morning mist clung to the streets like a blanket, refusing to be pulled away. But before the sun had fully risen, something fell from the clouds and tore through the normalcy of this ordinary place, transforming it into ground zero for what would become one of the most disturbing and credible UFO incidents ever documented. What descended that morning was witnessed by multiple people across different locations, none of whom knew each other, yet all describing the same impossible thing. A craft trailing smoke and falling in pieces toward the earth, the smell of sulfur and ammonia that followed. And then came the creatures, 5 of them, scattered across the town like fragments of a nightmare made flesh. These were not the gray-skinned, large-eyed visitors of popular imagination. Witnesses described something far more unsettling. Creatures with brown, oily skin that seemed to sweat a viscous substance, red eyes that glowed in the darkness, 3 protrusions on the head like horns or antennae, and the smell, that overwhelming, choking stench that burned the nostrils and throat of anyone who came near. By nightfall, the Brazilian military had cordoned off entire sections of the town. Trucks rolled through streets that had never seen such activity. Men in hazmat suits moved with urgent purpose, carrying something covered and contained. A young police officer who encountered one of the creatures would be dead within days, his body ravaged by an infection no doctor could explain. His family was warned to stay silent. The witnesses who spoke anyway would face harassment, ridicule, and threats that suggested someone wanted Varginha to forget what it had seen. But some things once witnessed cannot be unseen. Some truths leave scars that silence cannot heal. And in this small Brazilian town, too many people saw the same impossible things for it all to be dismissed as mass hysteria or lies. Something came down from the sky that day. Something that changed Varginha forever. And someone went to extraordinary lengths to make sure the world would never know what really happened. The sky above Varginha had just begun to soften from black to deep purple when the first witnesses spotted it. In those quiet hours before dawn on Saturday, January 20th, 1996, while most of the city's 100,000 residents slept, something was moving through the darkness above them. It was 20 minutes past 1 in the morning when a young couple, standing on their apartment balcony, noticed what they would later describe as a submarine floating through the cloud. The object was enormous, cigar-shaped, perhaps 15 meters long, and it was completely silent as it glided through the pre-dawn sky. But what made them freeze, what made the woman grip her husband's arm with enough force to leave marks, was the smoke. Thick, white smoke poured from one end of the craft, billowing out in dense clouds that caught the faint moonlight and seemed to glow with an otherworldly phosphorescence. The couple watched in stunned silence as the object descended lower and lower, moving with deliberate purpose toward the northern edge of the city, toward the neighborhood known as Jardim Andere. They were not alone in witnessing this spectacle. As the mysterious craft continued its slow descent, more eyes turned skyward. A taxi driver making his final run of the night slammed on his brakes in the middle of a deserted street, staring upward through his windshield. A security guard at a local factory stepped out for a cigarette and forgot to light it, watching instead as the cigar-shaped anomaly drifted overhead, trailing its strange vapor. A woman feeding her newborn baby by the window saw it pass, close enough that she could see the surface appeared metallic, reflecting the sparse city lights with a dull sheen. Each witness would later report the same details independently: the shape, the size, the silent movement, and most importantly, the smoke that poured from it like blood from a wound, suggesting something had gone terribly wrong. By the time the sun rose over Varginha that Saturday morning, something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the city. The witnesses who had seen the craft descend were already on their phones, calling friends and family, their voices urgent and confused. But what transformed scattered sightings into citywide unease was what began happening as the morning light spread across Varginha. Military vehicles started appearing in the northern neighborhoods. Not just one or two, but convoys of them. Olive green trucks, with canvas covers, rolled through residential streets where such vehicles had never been seen before. Residents stepping out to buy bread or milk for breakfast stopped in their doorways, watching as soldiers in uniform set up what could only be described as search perimeters. Maria Aparecida lived on a quiet street in Jardim Andere, and she was hanging laundry when the first military truck rumbled past her house. She remembers the time exactly because her favorite radio program had just ended. It was 7:30 in the morning. The truck moved slowly, deliberately, and men in the back were scanning the yards and alleyways with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. Within the hour, she counted 5 more trucks. Then came the fire department vehicles, their red paint stark against the morning light. But their sirens were silent. They rolled through the streets with purpose, but without the usual urgency of an emergency response. These vehicles were searching, hunting, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for, even if the residents watching them did not. By mid-morning, the roadblocks appeared. On Avenida Mato Grosso, one of the main arteries leading to the northern districts, military personnel set up barriers. Cars were being stopped, drivers questioned. Some residents were turned away entirely, told to find alternate routes, given no explanation for the sudden restriction. Joano Batista, a truck driver trying to make his Saturday deliveries, sat in his cab for 40 minutes at one such roadblock, watching as soldiers conferred in tight groups, speaking into radios, their body language tense and focused. When he finally asked one of them what was happening, the young soldier looked at him with an expression João would remember for years. It was not annoyance or authority. It was fear. The soldier told him there had been an incident, nothing to worry about. Please turn around. But his eyes told a different story. In the city center, the Corpo de Bomberos, the fire department, was experiencing its own strange Saturday. Multiple units had been called out in the early morning hours, but the dispatches were unusual. Firefighters who reported for duty that day found themselves given vague instructions about a recovery operation in the Jardim Andere area. Some were told to bring capture equipment, the kind normally used for dangerous animals. Others were instructed to work alongside military personnel, which was highly irregular for a typical fire department operation. Lieutenant Marco Chereze was among those called in. He and his team were directed to a wooded area near the park, told to search carefully, told that what they were looking for might be injured, might be dangerous. But when the men asked what exactly they were hunting, their commanders had no clear answer. Just search, they were told. You will know it when you see it. The presence of so many official vehicles, so many uniforms, so many serious faces speaking into radios created a ripple effect through Varginha. By late morning, the streets were filled with residents standing in clusters, pointing, speculating. The outdoor market in the city center, usually bustling with Saturday shoppers, was half empty. People were distracted, anxious, trading information and rumors. Have you heard what is happening in Jardim Andere? Did you see the military trucks? My cousin said they are searching the woods behind the park. My neighbor said she saw them carrying equipment into that abandoned building on Rua Ernesto Silva Datai. The atmosphere was electric with uncertainty, that peculiar tension that comes when the normal rules of daily life suddenly do not seem to apply. What made the official response so unsettling was its scale and its secrecy. This was not a single fire truck responding to a reported emergency. This was not a police car investigating a disturbance. This was coordinated, military-level mobilization happening in a civilian area during peacetime, with no official explanation offered to the thousands of people watching it unfold. Carmen Rodriguez lived 3 blocks from where much of the activity was concentrated. From her second-floor window, she had a clear view of the park and the surrounding streets. She spent most of that Saturday watching, and what she saw convinced her that the authorities were not just searching. They were hunting. The patterns of movement, the way teams would converge on specific locations, the urgent radio communications, all of it suggested they were tracking something, following a trail. The wooded area near the park became a focal point of activity. Witnesses reported seeing soldiers and firefighters entering the trees in organized lines, moving through the underbrush methodically. Some residents claimed they saw nets being carried in, large sturdy nets like those used to capture big cats or other dangerous wildlife. Others reported seeing what looked like cage equipment being unloaded from trucks. But what were they trying to catch? What had fallen from the sky in the pre-dawn hours that required this level of response? The official silence was deafening. No statements were issued. No press conferences were held. The local radio stations had nothing to report, except what their listeners were calling in to describe: a city suddenly occupied by its own military, searching for something no one would name. By early afternoon, some of the roadblocks were removed, but the official presence remained heavy throughout the northern districts. Residents reported seeing soldiers going door to door in certain areas, asking questions. Did you see anything unusual? Have you noticed anything strange in your yard or near your property? The questions were pointed but vague, suggesting the questioners themselves might not know exactly what they were looking for. Or perhaps they knew but could not say. This ambiguity, this wall of official non-communication, amplified the fear and speculation that was spreading through Varginha like a contagion. What transformed this from merely unusual to truly frightening was the disconnect between the massive official response and the absolute lack of official explanation. In any normal emergency, authorities communicate with the public. They issue warnings, provide updates, explain what is happening and what people should do. But on this Saturday in Varginha, the silence from official sources was total. The military was not there, as far as any public statement was concerned. The extensive search operations were not happening. The roadblocks were temporary traffic management. The questions being asked door to door were routine inquiries. But everyone in the northern districts of the city knew better. They could see with their own eyes that something unprecedented was unfolding. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the official vehicles began to thin out, but they did not disappear entirely. A perimeter seemed to be maintained around certain areas. Guards were posted at locations that had previously been unrestricted public space, and the residents of Varginha were left with a day's worth of observations that did not add up to any rational explanation. A cigar-shaped craft descending before dawn, trailing smoke like a wounded bird, military convoys in residential streets, fire department teams carrying capture equipment into the woods, roadblocks with no explanation, door-to-door questioning about unspecified anomalies, and through it all, the heavy presence of authority figures who knew something, who were responding to something real and urgent, but who would say nothing about what that something might be. As darkness fell again on Varginha that Saturday night, the city felt different than it had 24 hours before. Something had arrived in the night, something had scattered or escaped or been released, and whatever it was, the authorities were still looking for it, even as they insisted to the public that nothing unusual had occurred at all. The stage was set for what would come next, for the encounters that would transform this day of official activity and civilian anxiety into one of the most compelling and disturbing cases in the history of unexplained phenomena. But for now, as Saturday the 20th of January 1996 drew to a close, Varginha waited in the darkness, wondering what would emerge when the sun rose again. The afternoon sun hung heavy over Jardim Andere on January 20th, 1996, casting long shadows across the red clay earth of this working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Varginha. The day had been sweltering, typical of the Brazilian summer, and most residents sought refuge indoors during the hottest hours. But 3 young women were making their way home, walking the familiar paths they had traveled countless times before, completely unaware that the next few minutes would fracture their understanding of reality and mark them forever as witnesses to something that defied explanation. Liliane Fatima Silva was 22 years old. Her sister Valkyria Silva was 14, and their friend Katia Andrade Xavier was 22. They were not children prone to flights of fancy. They were sensible young women from hard-working families, the kind of people who kept their heads down, went about their business, and had no interest in becoming the subject of gossip or ridicule. Liliane worked as a domestic helper. Valkyria was still in school. Katia held down a steady job. They were, by every measure, credible individuals with reputations to protect, and nothing whatsoever to gain from fabricating a story that would make them objects of scrutiny, skepticism, and even mockery. It was approximately 3:30 in the afternoon when they turned onto the dirt road that would take them home. The street was quiet, as it often was during this hour, with most people sheltering from the punishing heat. On their left, they passed a vacant lot, an empty space between buildings where weeds grew wild and garbage sometimes accumulated. It was the kind of urban dead zone that exists in every neighborhood, a place people walked past without paying much attention, A forgettable corner of forgettable landscape. But on this day, something in that vacant lot caught their attention. At first, it was just a shape. A form crouching against the wall at the far edge of the lot. The initial assumption, the rational explanation that any mind would grasp for, was that it was a person, perhaps someone who was ill or injured, someone who needed help. But as they drew closer, as their eyes began to process the details of what they were actually seeing, that comfortable explanation dissolved like sugar in water. The creature was squatting with its back against the wall, its knees drawn up toward its body, its long arms hanging down between its legs. It was small, perhaps no more than 1 meter to 1.5 meters tall, though its exact height was difficult to determine given its crouched position. But what struck them immediately, what triggered an instinctive response of wrongness deep in their primitive brains, was that this was not a human being. Every detail of its appearance screamed alien, other, impossible. Its skin was brown, but not the warm brown of human flesh. Witnesses would later struggle to describe the exact quality of that color, settling on descriptions like oily, slick, shiny in places, but also somehow textured. The skin appeared to glisten in the afternoon light, as though it were moist or coated with some kind of secretion. There was something amphibian about it, something that reminded them of creatures that belonged in water or damp places, not squatting in the dust of a Brazilian vacant lot under the brutal summer sun. The body was thin, almost emaciated, with a fragility that was immediately apparent. This was not a powerful being. It was not some monster poised to attack. If anything, the creature appeared weak, vulnerable, perhaps even suffering. Its movements were slow and deliberate, as though it lacked the strength for sudden motion. The witnesses would later emphasize this point again and again, the creature's apparent frailty, because it complicated the narrative that skeptics wanted to impose. Why would they fabricate a story about a helpless being? Why not invent something more dramatic, more threatening, more cinematically impressive? But what truly captured their attention, what locked their gaze and sent the first real tendrils of fear curling through their chests, were the eyes. The creature's eyes were large, disproportionately large for its small head, and they glowed with a deep, unsettling red color. Not the red of human eyes caught in a photograph's flash. Not the red of irritation or disease. This was a luminous red, a color that seemed to emanate from within, that caught the light and held it in a way that organic tissue should not. Those eyes turned toward them, and in that moment of connection, all 3 women felt the full weight of an intelligence behind that alien gaze. This thing was aware. It saw them. It knew they were there. The head itself was unlike any animal they had recognized. It was somewhat elongated, with a prominent structure that rose from the crown in a distinctive V-shaped pattern. 3 bumps or protrusions sat on the forehead, arranged in a triangular formation. These features gave the skull a ridged, almost geometric quality, as though whatever genetic blueprint had created this being operated according to principles different from terrestrial biology. There was no hair, no fur, nothing to soften the strangeness of that alien architecture. As they stood there, frozen between the impulse to approach and the instinct to flee, another sensation assaulted them. A smell. It wafted across the vacant lot, carried on the hot afternoon breeze, and it was unlike anything they had encountered before. It was not quite animal, not quite chemical. Some would later describe it as sulfurous, others as reminiscent of ammonia, still others simply as wrong, as a scent that their olfactory systems registered but could not categorize. It was the smell of something out of place, something that did not belong in their world. For a handful of seconds that stretched into subjective hours, the 3 women and the creature regarded each other across the dusty lot. The being made no aggressive moves. It did not stand or advance. It simply crouched there, those red eyes fixed on them, its thin chest rising and falling with what might have been labored breathing. There was something almost pitiful about it, something that might have evoked compassion under different circumstances. But the overwhelming alienness of its appearance, the fundamental wrongness of its existence in this mundane setting, triggered something deeper than compassion. It triggered fear. The spell broke suddenly. One of them, accounts vary as to who moved first, took a step backward. That single movement released the paralysis that had held all 3. Without discussion, without debate, they turned and ran. They ran with the pure, animal panic of prey that has locked eyes with a predator, even though this predator appeared barely capable of pursuing them. They ran because every instinct screamed that they needed distance, that they needed walls and doors between themselves and that thing in the vacant lot. Their flight home was a blur of pounding footsteps and racing heartbeats. They burst through the door of the Silva family home, breathless and terrified, their words tumbling over each other as they tried to explain to Luisa Helena Silva, the mother of Liliane and Valkyria, what they had just witnessed. They spoke of the creature, the eyes, the impossible reality of what they had seen in broad daylight just blocks from their home. Luisa Helena's initial response was exactly what one might expect from a practical woman confronted with an extraordinary claim from her daughters. She was skeptical. She was concerned that they might be playing a prank, or had perhaps encountered someone in a costume trying to frighten them. The story they told was simply too bizarre, too removed from everyday experience to accept without question. She likely suspected heat stroke, or misperception, or any of the dozen rational explanations that the mind offers when confronted with the impossible. But the terror in their faces was real. The trembling in their voices was genuine. These were not the performances of young women engaged in mischief. These were the reactions of individuals who had experienced something deeply traumatic. So, despite her doubts, despite the improbability of their account, Luisa Helena agreed to return to the vacant lot with them. The four women walked back to the site of the encounter, moving cautiously now, alert for any sign of the creature. When they reached the vacant lot, the being was gone. The space was empty. Nothing but weeds and scattered debris and the afternoon sun beating down on red earth. For a moment, it seemed as though the experience would remain purely testimonial, a story without corroboration, destined to be doubted and dismissed. But then Luisa Helena saw the impressions in the mud. There, along the base of the wall where the creature had been crouching, the damp earth bore clear markings. Depressions in the soil that suggested something had been pressing against that spot. Marks that corresponded with where the witnesses said they had seen the being. The mud held the ghost of its presence, physical evidence that something had indeed been in that exact location. Luisa Helena's skepticism evaporated. Whatever her daughters and their friend had encountered, it had been real enough to leave traces. It had substance. It had weight. It had existed in physical space and time. The fear that filled her then was different from the immediate terror that the young women had experienced. Theirs had been the visceral response to a direct encounter. Hers was the slower, colder fear that comes from understanding. If such a thing could appear in a vacant lot in the middle of the afternoon, if it could crouch there vulnerable and exposed just meters from people's homes, then the world was not what she had believed it to be. The comfortable certainties that governed everyday life had been revealed as illusions. The lives of these three young women were irrevocably changed from that moment forward. In the days and weeks that followed, as their story spread through Varginha and then beyond, they would face interrogation by military personnel, interviews by researchers, attention from media outlets, and inevitable skepticism from those who found their account too strange to accept. They would be accused of seeking attention, of fabricating stories, of being unreliable witnesses despite their previously unblemished reputations. But they never wavered in their testimony. They never changed the essential details of what they had seen. They described the creature consistently, separately, without contradiction. And they did so knowing that their story would make their lives more difficult, not easier. They persisted in their account despite having everything to lose and nothing tangible to gain. This is what makes their testimony so compelling. These were not UFO enthusiasts hoping to validate their beliefs. They were not individuals with a history of making outlandish claims. They were ordinary young women, living ordinary lives, who happened to walk past a vacant lot at precisely the wrong moment. Or perhaps the right moment, depending on how one views such things. They were witnesses who never asked for that role, who would likely have chosen to walk a different route home if they could have foreseen the consequences of what they were about to see. On the afternoon of January 20th, 1996, in a forgettable vacant lot in an unremarkable neighborhood, three young women encountered something that should not exist, and their willingness to speak about it, to endure the scrutiny and skepticism that followed, opens a door to questions that extend far beyond that single afternoon in Varginha. Questions about what shares our world. Questions about what we're willing to see and what we choose to dismiss. Questions about the price of testimony and the burden of truth. The military trucks arrived before dawn. That single detail repeated by witness after witness in the days following the girls' encounter at the Varginha Zoo would become one of the most chilling elements of the entire affair. The soldiers didn't show up after reports filtered through official channels. They didn't arrive in response to emergency calls or civilian panic. They were already there, or so close by that their response time defied explanation. It was as if someone, somewhere, had been waiting for exactly this kind of call. Luisa Helena Silva was returning home from her night shift at a textile factory when she saw them. The time was approximately 5:45 in the morning on January 21, 1996, less than 5 hours after Lillian, Valkyria, and Katia had fled from their encounter near the wall. Luisa lived on a street that ran parallel to where the girls had their sighting, separated by only a few blocks and a stretch of scrubland. She told investigators that she counted at least 4 military vehicles moving slowly through the neighborhood, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. 2 were standard army trucks with canvas covers over the cargo beds. The other 2 were smaller vehicles, what she described as jeeps or utility trucks. What struck her most wasn't just the presence of military vehicles in a residential area at such an odd hour. It was the deliberate way they moved, sweeping through the streets in a clear pattern, as if searching for something specific. The trucks would pause at intersections, soldiers would peer down side streets with high-powered flashlights, and then they would move on. She watched from her kitchen window as one truck stopped directly in front of a vacant lot, 2 houses down from hers. Several soldiers jumped out, all wearing gloves and carrying what looked like nets and long poles with loops at the ends, the kind animal control officers might use. Luisa wasn't the only one watching. Across the street, her neighbor Osvaldo Reis had also been awakened by the sound of diesel engines and radio chatter. Osvaldo, a retired municipal worker who had served briefly in the military himself decades earlier, recognized the insignia on the vehicles. They were from the ESE, the Escola de Sargentos de Armas, the School of Sergeants of Arms, located just a few kilometers outside Varginha. But what were military instructors and trainees doing conducting what appeared to be a search operation in a civilian neighborhood? The answer came quickly and disturbingly. According to Osvaldo's testimony, given weeks later to researchers who had begun investigating the case, he watched as a group of approximately 6 soldiers moved into the vacant lot with their nets and poles extended. Their movements were cautious, coordinated, exactly the kind of tactical approach used when dealing with something dangerous. One soldier gestured to the others, pointing toward a cluster of bushes near the back of the lot. The group tightened their formation, and then they moved in quickly. What happened next, Osvaldo said, would stay with him for the rest of his life. There was a sound, high-pitched and distressed, like nothing he had ever heard before. It wasn't an animal sound he could identify, not a dog or cat or any wildlife native to the region. It was something else entirely, something that made his skin crawl even from the safety of his window. The soldiers lunged forward with their nets, and there was a struggle. He couldn't see clearly what they were capturing, but he could see the nets bulging and thrashing, something alive and fighting desperately against the restraints. The operation took less than 3 minutes from the moment they entered the lot until they emerged carrying something wrapped in what appeared to be a tarpaulin or heavy canvas. Whatever was inside was still moving. Osvaldo could see the fabric undulating as the soldiers carried their cargo to one of the covered trucks. They loaded it into the back, secured the canvas cover, and within moments, the entire convoy was rolling out of the neighborhood, heading north toward the SA base. But the military's activities that morning were far from over. Multiple witnesses across different parts of Varginha reported similar scenes throughout the early morning hours. Carlos Alberto Souza, a baker who was opening his shop on Rua Paysandu at approximately 6:30 in the morning, saw soldiers conducting another search in an alley behind a row of commercial buildings. He watched them from his back door, afraid to approach but unable to look away. Once again, there were the nets, the poles, the tactical movements of trained personnel. Once again there was a capture, though Carlos couldn't see clearly what had been caught. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't a random response or a confused reaction to strange reports. This was a coordinated operation conducted by trained military personnel who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly how to capture it. The equipment was specialized, the tactics were rehearsed, and the speed of the response suggested advanced planning. But how could they have planned for something like this? Unless, of course, they had known something was already in the area, something that had perhaps escaped or crash-landed, something they had been tracking. The most detailed account of the capture operation came from a man who requested anonymity for years, fearing repercussions for speaking out. Researchers referred to him simply as Witness X. He was a low-ranking soldier stationed at the SA who had been part of the capture team that morning. His testimony, shared in fragments over multiple interviews, painted a picture of an operation that had been activated in the middle of the night, hours before the sun rose. According to Witness X, the orders came down shortly after 2 in the morning. Personnel were awakened, equipment was distributed, and teams were deployed to specific grid coordinates throughout the city. They were told they were searching for an escaped exotic animal, possibly dangerous, that needed to be captured alive if possible. But the equipment they were given suggested something more unusual than any ordinary animal. The nets were reinforced with metal threading. The poles had electronic prods attached, and every soldier was issued thick protective gloves and instructed not to make direct skin contact with the target under any circumstances. Witness X was part of the team that made the capture in the vacant lot that Osvaldo had witnessed. He described the creature as small, approximately the size of a young child, with dark reddish-brown skin that appeared moist or oily. It had been hiding in the bushes, seemingly weakened or injured. When they approached, it made no attempt to flee, only that terrible sound, a high-pitched wailing that communicated fear and distress in a way that transcended species. The creature's eyes, he said, were the most disturbing feature, large and red, watching the soldiers with an expression that seemed unmistakably intelligent and terrified. They netted it quickly, wrapped it in the tarpaulin to prevent injury during transport, and loaded it into the truck. Witness X rode in the back with 2 other soldiers, tasked with keeping the creature secure. During the drive to the SA base, he could feel it moving beneath the wrapping, trembling, alive and aware of its captivity. The journey took less than 15 minutes. At the SA base, the captured creature was held for only a few hours. Witness X wasn't privy to what examinations or procedures took place during that time, but by mid-morning, new orders had come through. The creature was to be transferred immediately to Humanitas Hospital, a regional medical facility on the northern edge of Varginha. The transfer was conducted with even more security than the initial capture. The creature was placed in a sealed container, loaded into an ambulance escorted by military vehicles, and transported under armed guard. It was at the hospital that the operation began to involve civilians who had no idea what they were being drawn into. Nurse Auxiliadora Maria Silva was working the day shift in the emergency wing when the military convoy arrived. She watched through the window as soldiers in full uniform surrounded an ambulance, creating a perimeter before allowing anything to be unloaded. Then came the container, metallic and featureless, carried by 4 men who moved with extreme care. They brought it directly into a sealed examination room that had been cleared of all other staff. Auxiliadora and several other nurses were told that the room was off limits, that a special patient requiring isolation was being treated, and that they should continue with their other duties. But hospitals are environments where secrets are difficult to keep. Staff talk, orderlies see things, cleaning crews enter rooms after procedures are finished. Within hours, rumors were spreading through Humanitas Hospital that something highly unusual had been brought in. Something that wasn't human, but wasn't an animal either. One orderly claimed to have glimpsed the patient when doctors were transferring it to an examination table. He described the same features others had reported: small stature, reddish-brown skin, large head, enormous dark red eyes. Dr. Cesario Lincoln Furtado, who worked at Humanitas, later confirmed that a special patient had been admitted under military supervision on January 21st, and that access to the patient was restricted to specific personnel. He stopped short of describing what the patient was, but his carefully worded statements suggested something extraordinary had indeed occurred. The creature remained at the hospital for less than 24 hours before being transferred again. this time to an unknown location. But how many creatures had been captured? This question haunted investigators for years. The girls had seen one. Multiple witnesses reported military captures at different locations throughout the morning. Were these separate creatures, or were soldiers tracking a single entity as it moved through the city? Witness X believed there had been at least 2 captures, possibly 3. Other sources suggested the number might have been higher. The most troubling piece of the puzzle involved reports from a second hospital. Regional Hospital of Varginha, a larger facility than Humanitas, was also rumored to have received something unusual under military guard. Staff members there reported similar scenes: armed soldiers, sealed rooms, orders for absolute discretion. Some whispered that one of the creatures brought to regional hospital had died, either from injuries sustained during capture or from some other cause. These rumors were never confirmed, but they persisted. What became clear, through the accumulation of witness testimonies and leaked information, was that the military operation in Varginha on January 21st was not improvisational. It was systematic, coordinated, and executed with a level of preparation that suggested advanced knowledge. The soldiers knew what equipment to bring. They knew how to handle the creatures safely. They knew which facilities to use for containment and examination. This wasn't first contact. This was retrieval. The trucks that rolled out of Varginha that morning carried more than strange creature. They carried questions that authorities refused to answer, secrets that would fester and grow in the absence of official transparency. Where did the creatures come from? How many were captured? What happened to them after they disappeared behind military security? And most unsettling of all, how long had the military known that something was out there? The sun had barely crept over the horizon in Varginha on that January morning, when Luisa Helena Silva arrived at the municipal zoo for her early shift. It was 20 to 5 in the morning, and the air still held that particular chill that comes just before dawn breaks completely. Luisa had worked at the zoo for nearly 7 years, and she prided herself on knowing every animal's temperament, every routine, every subtle shift in behavior. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she would witness that morning. As she made her rounds through the animal enclosures, she noticed something was profoundly wrong. The normally vocal howler monkeys sat in complete silence, huddled together in the farthest corner of their habitat. Their eyes, she would later tell investigators, seemed fixed on something beyond the fence line, tracking something she couldn't see. The capybaras, typically eager for their morning feeding, had retreated into their shelters and refused to emerge. Even when Luisa called to them with her familiar voice and rattled their food containers, they remained hidden, making low, distressed sounds she had never heard them produce before. But it was the big cats that truly alarmed her. The jaguars, powerful and confident predators, paced frantically along the back walls of their enclosure, as far from the front viewing area as possible. One of them, a male named Machado, released a series of guttural vocalizations that sounded less like territorial warnings and more like genuine fear. Luisa had seen these animals face down veterinary procedures and territory disputes with other males without flinching. Whatever had disturbed them went deeper than anything in their normal experience. Then, at approximately 5:15 in the morning, Luisa saw it. Near the perimeter fence of the zoo, partially obscured by the pre-dawn shadows, stood a figure unlike anything she had encountered. It was roughly 4 feet tall, with dark brown skin that seemed oddly textured, almost oily in appearance. The head was disproportionately large for the body, and even from a distance, she could make out those eyes, enormous red or reddish-brown orbs that seemed to catch and reflect what little light existed at that hour. The creature appeared disoriented, swaying slightly as if injured or exhausted. For several seconds, Luisa stood frozen, her mind struggling to categorize what her eyes were showing her. Then, as if sensing her gaze, the creature turned its attention directly toward her. The moment their eyes met, Luisa felt a wave of instinctive terror wash over her, something primal that bypassed rational thought entirely. She stumbled backward, and by the time she had steadied herself and looked again, the creature had vanished into the vegetation beyond the fence line. The zoo animals remained agitated throughout the entire day. Several refused to eat. Others would not leave their shelters even as the sun climbed high and temperatures rose. The veterinary staff conducted examinations, but could find no medical explanation for the mass behavioral disturbance. Louisa filed a report with her supervisor, who listened with growing concern but had no framework for understanding what she described. What neither of them knew at the time was that Louisa's sighting was just one piece of a much larger puzzle that was unfolding across Varginha that day. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, just over an hour after Louisa's encounter at the zoo, a woman named Orlena Augusta de Freitas was beginning her day in the Jardim Andere neighborhood. Orlena was a mother of 5, a practical woman not given to flights of fancy or superstition. She was sweeping the small yard outside her home when a movement caught her peripheral vision. Looking up, she saw what she initially thought might be a large dog, or perhaps a lost child crouched behind a low wall near her property. But as she moved closer to investigate, her perception shifted dramatically. The entity was clearly not a child, nor any animal she recognized. It was squatting in an oddly balanced position, its long thin arms hanging down between its legs. The skin was brown and appeared to have an unusual sheen to it, almost as if the creature was covered in some kind of oil or mucus. The head was the most disturbing feature, bulbous and hairless, with 3 pronounced bumps or ridges running vertically along the crown. And the eyes, those terrible eyes, were enormous and reddish, with no visible white portions, just dark pupils surrounded by that unsettling reddish tone. Orlena would later tell investigators that the creature appeared to be in distress. It seemed weak, possibly injured, and there was a strong, unpleasant odor emanating from it, something she compared to ammonia mixed with rotting organic matter. The smell was so intense that it made her eyes water. Despite her fear, she felt an unexpected surge of pity for the being. It looked lost and suffering, far from wherever it belonged. But her maternal instincts warred with her terror, and ultimately, fear won. She retreated into her home, locked the doors, and watched from her window as the creature remained in its position for several more minutes before slowly moving away, disappearing into an area of overgrown vegetation and abandoned lots. What Orlena didn't know was that at that very moment, in a different part of Varginha, 3 young women were about to have the encounter that would eventually bring international attention to the case. But the story doesn't end with these incidents. As investigators later pieced together the timeline, evidence emerged suggesting that at least 5 separate creatures were roaming different parts of Varginha that day. In the Santa Luzia neighborhood, a construction worker named Henrico Jose reported seeing what he described as a small humanoid figure moving erratically through an empty lot around 7 in the morning. He had assumed at first it was a homeless person, or perhaps someone who was drunk or drug impaired. But as he got closer, he realized the figure's proportions were all wrong. The head was too large, the limbs too thin and elongated. The way it moved was unsettling, not quite walking, not quite crawling, but something in between. Henry called out, asking if the person needed help, but the figure seemed not to hear or not to comprehend. It continued its awkward progression until it reached a drainage culvert and disappeared into the darkness within. Later that afternoon, around 2 o'clock, a shopkeeper named Carlos Alberto witnessed what he believed was the same type of creature attempting to navigate across Avenida Cesar Alves. The entity seemed confused by the traffic, freezing in place as vehicles approached, then scuttling sideways in a manner that Carlos said reminded him of a crab. Several drivers stopped, and a small crowd began to gather, but before anyone could get close enough for a clear look, the creature bolted with surprising speed into an alleyway between buildings. Carlos noted that the thing seemed to be favoring one side, as if injured, and left behind a trail of what looked like oily residue on the pavement. What makes the Varginha case particularly compelling to researchers is the remarkable consistency across these multiple independent witness accounts. These were people from different neighborhoods, different social backgrounds, different age groups. Most had no knowledge of each other's experiences until days or even weeks later, when investigators began connecting the dots. Yet their descriptions aligned in striking detail. All reported a creature approximately 4 feet tall. All described the disproportionately large head with prominent ridges or bumps. All mentioned the enormous reddish or reddish-brown eyes. All noted the dark brown, oily-looking skin. All commented on a strong, unpleasant odor, and all described the creature as appearing disoriented, weakened, or injured. This consistency is crucial because it addresses one of the primary skeptical arguments against mass sightings. When people fabricate stories or when sightings result from misidentification or hysteria, the details typically diverge significantly. Witnesses add embellishments, descriptions shift based on leading questions or media coverage, and the narrative fragments. But in Varginha, the core details remained remarkably stable across testimonies, collected independently and in some cases before any media coverage existed. Dr. Ubirayara Franco Rodrigues, a researcher who conducted extensive interviews with the witnesses, noted that these individuals displayed none of the typical signs of fabrication or attention-seeking behavior. Many were reluctant to come forward at all, concerned about ridicule or unwanted attention. Some only agreed to speak after learning that others had seen similar things, finding courage in numbers. The emotional responses also tracked as genuine. Witnesses displayed classic symptoms of having experienced genuine trauma or profound shock. They had intrusive memories, difficulty sleeping, persistent anxiety when discussing the events. These are not the responses of people enjoying a hoax or seeking fame. The theory that emerged from the accumulation of evidence was that multiple entities had indeed been scattered across Varginha, likely as a result of whatever incident had occurred the night before, when so many residents reported seeing a strange craft descending over the city. If a vehicle of some kind had crash-landed or experienced a malfunction, it's conceivable that its occupants would have scattered, seeking shelter or attempting to evade capture. The behavior witnesses described, the disorientation, the apparent injuries, the attempts to hide, all support this interpretation. The animal reactions at the zoo provide another layer of corroboration. Animals, particularly predators and prey species, have finely tuned threat detection systems. Their mass behavioral disturbance, occurring before most of the human sightings that day, suggests they detected something genuinely anomalous in their environment, something that triggered deep instinctive alarm. The fact that the animals remained disturbed throughout the day, long after the immediate presence of the creature had passed, indicates the encounter affected them profoundly. As darkness fell on January 20th, 1996, the citizens of Varginha found themselves in a state of collective unease. Rumors were beginning to spread from neighborhood to neighborhood. People who had witnessed something strange were cautiously sharing their experiences, finding to their shock and relief that others had seen similar things. The local authorities were receiving calls, most of which were being dismissed or ignored. But behind the scenes, other forces were beginning to mobilize. Forces that would turn Varginha from a quiet agricultural city into the center of one of the most compelling and controversial UFO cases in modern history. The creatures were out there somewhere in the darkness, scattered and vulnerable, and the hunt was about to begin. Marco Eli Chereze was 23 years old on the 20th of January, 1996. He was a military police officer stationed in Varginha, Brazil, a young man in excellent health with his entire life stretching before him. By February 15th of that same year, less than 4 weeks later, he would be dead. The official explanations for his death would shift like sand. First pneumonia, then toxic exposure, then a vague respiratory collapse that satisfied no one who knew him. But those who were there, those who saw what happened to his body in those final agonizing weeks, they knew the truth that the military would never acknowledge. Marco Chereze died because he touched something he was never meant to touch. The call came in during the early evening hours of January 20th. Multiple military units were mobilized across Varginha that day, responding to reports of unusual creatures spotted throughout the city. Marco was part of the Segundo Batalhão de Polícia do Exército, the 2nd Battalion of Military Police, and when the orders came down, he responded without hesitation. This was his duty, his training, his purpose. He had no way of knowing that this particular call would be his last. According to testimony from fellow officers who survived that day, the capture operation took place in a residential area on the outskirts of the city. The creature had been cornered, reportedly injured or weakened from its earlier encounters. Witnesses described it as small, roughly the height of a child, with brown oily skin that seemed to glisten even in the fading daylight. Its head was disproportionately large, dominated by enormous red eyes that tracked the movements of the approaching soldiers with an intelligence that was deeply, fundamentally raw. Marco was among the first to make physical contact with the entity, Multiple sources confirm that he actually handled the creature during the capture process, his bare hands making contact with its strange skin as they worked to subdue and contain it. Some reports suggest he helped lift it into a military vehicle. Others say he wrapped it in some kind of netting or containment material. The exact details vary depending on who tells the story, but on one point, every account agrees. Marco Chereze touched the creature with his own hands, and the creature, in whatever capacity it possessed consciousness or will, touched him back. For the first day or two, nothing seemed wrong. Marco returned home after the operation, exhausted but seemingly unharmed. He spoke with his family about the day's events, though he was careful, even then, about what he revealed. His sister would later recall that he seemed troubled, unusually quiet, his mind clearly working through something he couldn't quite articulate. But there were no obvious signs of injury, no wounds visible on his body, no immediate indication that anything had gone catastrophically wrong. The symptoms began on the third day. Marco woke with a fever, nothing dramatic at first, just a low-grade temperature that he attributed to stress or perhaps a minor flu. But the fever didn't break. Instead, it climbed steadily higher, accompanied by a weakness that seemed to settle into his bones. By the fourth day, he could barely stand. His family, increasingly alarmed, insisted he see a doctor. The medical professionals who examined Marco in those early days were baffled. His symptoms didn't align with any standard infection or illness they recognized. The fever was relentless, resistant to every medication they administered. His white blood cell count was catastrophically abnormal, suggesting his immune system was fighting something, but blood tests revealed no identifiable pathogen, no bacteria or virus that could explain his rapid deterioration. It was as if his body was being attacked by something invisible, something that left no trace conventional medicine could detect. Within a week of the capture operation, Marco was hospitalized. His condition had progressed with terrifying speed. The fever now raged unchecked, his temperature spiking to levels that should have caused permanent brain damage. His breathing became labored, his lungs filling with fluid that the doctors couldn't adequately drain or explain. Lesions began appearing on his skin, strange marks that his family would later describe as burns, though nothing had burned him. Some of these marks were on his hands and forearms, the areas that had made direct contact with the creature. But others appeared in places that defied explanation, scattered across his torso and legs, like some invisible fire had touched him from within. His family maintained a constant vigil at his bedside, watching helplessly as this vibrant young man seemed to dissolve before their eyes. His mother would later testify that she didn't recognize him on those final days. The swelling had distorted his features. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look already dead. But worse than the physical changes was the fear in his eyes. Marco was conscious through much of his decline, trapped inside a body that was betraying him, aware that he was dying and powerless to stop it. Before he lost the ability to speak coherently, Marco told his family things that would haunt them forever. He spoke about the creature, about its eyes, about the feeling of wrongness that had overwhelmed him the moment he touched its skin. According to his relatives, he described a sensation like electricity or poison moving through his hands, up his arms, spreading into his chest. He had felt it immediately during the capture, he told them, but had dismissed it as adrenaline or fear. Now, as his body failed around him, he understood what it truly was. The creature had infected him with something, marked him in some fundamental way that was now consuming him from the inside out. His sister Antonia would later give interviews describing Marco's final lucid moments. He begged her to tell people what had happened, to make sure that others knew the danger these creatures pose. He was terrified that more officers would be sent to handle these entities without proper protection, without understanding the lethal risk of direct contact. He made her promise that his death wouldn't be covered up, that the truth would come out. It was a promise she would spend years trying to keep, though the walls of military silence would prove nearly impenetrable. The doctors treating Marco tried everything. They administered broad-spectrum antibiotics on the theory that some exotic bacterial infection was responsible. When that failed, they moved to antivirals, then antifungals, casting about desperately for anything that might slow his decline. Nothing worked. It was as if his body had simply decided to shut down, systematically failing organ by organ despite every medical intervention. His kidneys began to fail. His liver showed signs of acute toxicity, though he had been exposed to no known toxins. His respiratory system deteriorated until machines were needed to force air into his collapsing lungs. In the hospital corridors, rumors began to circulate among the staff. Nurses whispered about the strange case in room 12, the young police officer who was dying of nothing anyone could name. Some of the medical personnel who treated Marco began experiencing their own unexplained symptoms. Minor illnesses, persistent fevers, nothing as severe as what Marco endured, but enough to generate real fear. Was whatever killed him contagious? Could it spread through casual contact? The hospital quietly increased its isolation protocols around Marco's room, though officially they maintained that he posed no risk to others. Military officials visited the hospital multiple times during Marco's decline. They came in uniform, speaking in low voices with the doctors, reviewing his charts, asking questions that the medical staff found oddly specific. What exactly were his symptoms? Had he said anything about the events of January 20th? Who had he spoken with about the operation? The family was strongly encouraged to limit their public statements about Marco's condition. There were implications, never quite stated directly, that his benefits and survivor payments might depend on their discretion. Marco's father, a simple working man with no understanding of military protocol or government bureaucracy, found himself facing stone walls at every turn. He demanded answers about what his son had been exposed to during the operation. He wanted to know if other officers were sick, if the military had any treatment protocols for whatever infection Marco had contracted. He was told nothing. Official channels closed in his face. His calls went unreturned. When he tried to speak with Marco's commanding officers, he was informed they were unavailable or had been transferred. It was a coordinated effort to contain information, to prevent the family from understanding or revealing what had truly happened to their son. On February 14, 1996, Marco Eli Chereze slipped into a coma. His organs were failing in cascade, his body shutting down system by system. The doctors told his family there was nothing more they could do. They recommended making him comfortable, letting nature take its course. His mother refused to leave his bedside, holding his hand, praying in whispered Portuguese for a miracle that would never come. He died at 2:17 in the morning on February 15th, 26 days after touching the creature. 26 days of progressive, agonizing decline. 26 days of his body being destroyed by something that left no trace medical science could identify. The official cause of death listed on his certificate was pneumonia secondary to an unspecified infection. Later, when questions persisted, the military would suggest he had been exposed to some kind of toxic chemical during the operation, though they never specified what chemical or why it had affected only him. The explanations shifted and changed depending on who was asking, and when, a sure sign that those providing the answers had no idea what the truth really was. But the family knew. They had watched him die. They had seen the marks on his body, heard his final terrified confessions about the creature and what it had done to him. They had witnessed the military's desperate attempts to contain information, to prevent the story from spreading, to bury their son's death under layers of bureaucratic obfuscation and official silence. Marco Eli Chereze was buried in a closed casket at his family's request. Too many strange marks on his body, too much deterioration that didn't match the official explanation of pneumonia. Those who carried his coffin noted how light it was, as if something had consumed him from within, leaving only a hollow shell behind. In the weeks following his death, at least 2 other military personnel involved in the January 20th operations reported unusual illnesses, though none as severe as Marco's. One recovered after a brief hospitalization. The other left the service and disappeared from public record. The military conducted no official investigation into possible connections between these illnesses and the capture operations. No safety protocols were revised. No warnings were issued to personnel who might handle similar entities in the future. Marco's family received his death benefits and a formal letter of appreciation for his service. They also received something less official, but far more memorable. A visit from an officer they had never met, someone high enough in rank that he traveled with an escort and spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He expressed condolences for their loss. He also made it very clear that continued public speculation about the circumstances of Marco's death would not be in the family's best interest. He never explicitly threatened them, but the implications were unmistakable. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. The silence that followed Marco Eli Chereze's death is its own kind of evidence. The speed with which his story was buried, the coordinated effort to prevent investigation, the military's absolute refusal to acknowledge any connection between the capture operations and his death, all of it points to something being actively concealed. All of it points to something being actively concealed. If Marco had simply died of pneumonia or accidental chemical exposure, there would be no need for such extreme information control. The cover-up reveals what the official statements deny. Something happened to Marco Chereze when he touched that creature. Something lethal. Something that defied medical explanation and terrified those in authority who understood its implications. To this day, his family maintains he was murdered, not by the creature directly, but by those who sent him to capture it without adequate protection, without warning, without any understanding of the risks involved. He was 23 years old, in perfect health, and dead within a month of following orders. That is the true horror of Marco Eli Chereze's story. He died serving his country, but his country won't acknowledge how or why. His sacrifice has been erased, his warnings ignored, his death transformed into a bureaucratic inconvenience to be filed away and forgotten. But some things refuse to stay buried. Marco's story persists despite the official silence, passed down through family testimony and whispered conversations, a warning that echoes through the decades. Contact with these entities is lethal. Those who touch them do so at mortal risk. And when they die from that contact, the authorities will deny everything, will rewrite the narrative, will sacrifice truth on the altar of secrecy. Marco Eli Chereze learned this lesson in the most terrible way possible. He paid for humanity's contact with the unknown, not just with his life, but with his story, his truth, his very memory, all of it nearly lost to the machinery of institutional denial. Nearly, but not quite, because his family remembers. And they still speak his name, still tell his story, still insist that the world know what really killed their son in those dark weeks of early 1996. The morning after Katia Andrade's death, military vehicles began arriving at the regional hospital in Varginha with unusual urgency. Hospital staff who had been on duty the previous night were pulled aside one by one into private rooms. The conversations that took place behind those closed doors would set a pattern that would repeat itself for months and years to come. Nurses who had witnessed the strange procedure involving the burned creature were told in no uncertain terms that they had seen nothing. Their memories, they were informed, were mistaken. What they thought they had witnessed was a misidentification of a vagrant suffering from severe medical conditions. The message was delivered with a peculiar combination of bureaucratic formality and barely concealed threat. Those who asked questions found themselves transferred to remote facilities within weeks. Those who remained silent kept their positions. Dr. Cesario Lincoln Furtado, the physician who had allegedly examined one of the captured entities, found his professional life becoming increasingly complicated. Colleagues reported that he seemed agitated in the days following the incident, withdrawn and reluctant to discuss his work. When approached by local researchers, he initially seemed willing to talk, then abruptly changed his demeanor. His family noticed the change too. The confident doctor who had always been eager to discuss interesting medical cases suddenly insisted that nothing unusual had occurred. His denials became more emphatic as time went on, his insistence more forceful. The transformation was so complete, so sudden, that even those closest to him recognized it as unnatural. Lieutenant Colonel Wanderley Rodrigo Becerra Santos, the commander who had allegedly overseen the initial capture operation, was transferred from Varginha to Brasilia with remarkable speed. Military transfers are routine, but the timing struck many as convenient. The officer who had been deeply involved in whatever had transpired in Varginha was suddenly removed from the area, placed in a position where access to him became virtually impossible. Other military personnel who had been present during the operation followed a similar pattern. Some were transferred. Others received promotions that came with new assignments far from Minas Gerais. The systematic dispersal of witnesses was executed with efficiency that suggested careful planning. For the three young women, whose encounter had started everything, Life became a strange mixture of attention and intimidation. Liliane and Valkyria Silva, along with Katia Andrade before her death, found themselves at the center of media interest that brought with it unwanted complications. Men in civilian clothes appeared near their homes, watching, waiting, never approaching, but always present. Phone calls came at odd hours, voices on the other end warning them to stop talking about what they had seen. The girls had never sought publicity. Their story had emerged almost accidentally through conversations with friends and family. Now they found themselves trapped in a nightmare where telling the truth brought consequences. The local firefighters who had responded to the initial capture call faced their own pressures. Firefighter Marco Eli Chereze had died under suspicious circumstances, his death attributed to a mysterious infection despite his previously excellent health. His fellow firefighters watched the official narrative take shape with growing unease. They knew what Marco had told them about that day. They knew he had handled something strange, something that had left him feeling ill almost immediately. But when military officials interviewed them, the message was clear. Marco had died of natural causes. Any suggestion otherwise was disrespectful to his memory and potentially harmful to their careers. The firefighters, trained to work within strict hierarchies, understood what was being asked of them. Most chose silence. Into this atmosphere of orchestrated denial came the civilian researchers. Yubira Jara Franco Rodriguez, a university professor and UFO investigator with decades of experience, recognized immediately that something extraordinary was being suppressed. Along with Vittorio Paccaccini, another seasoned researcher, Rodriguez began the painstaking work of documenting witness testimony, mapping timelines, and attempting to piece together what had actually happened in Varginha during those chaotic January days. The obstacles they encountered were unlike anything in their previous investigations. Witnesses who initially agreed to speak would suddenly refuse to answer their door. Others would grant interviews only to recant their statements days later, claiming they had been confused or mistaken. Rodriguez discovered that several witnesses had been visited by military intelligence officers shortly before changing their stories. The pattern was consistent and obvious. A witness would provide detailed testimony, then receive a visit, then suddenly develop severe memory problems regarding the specific events in question. The researchers documented these patterns, noting names, dates, and the timing of each reversal. They created charts showing the systematic progression of witness intimidation, the careful way in which the most credible testimonies were being neutralized one by one. The physical evidence proved even more elusive. Photographs allegedly taken by military personnel at the capture sites were mentioned in early reports, but never surfaced publicly. A zoo employee claimed to have seen unusual activity at the facility, including military vehicles and secretive nighttime operations, but was quickly dismissed from his position. The stated reason for his termination was unrelated to his claims, but the timing suggested otherwise. Veterinarian Lila Cabral, who allegedly examined one of the creatures, found herself unable or unwilling to discuss her involvement. When Paccaccini attempted to interview her, she refused, her face betraying fear that her words would not acknowledge. Documents began to leak despite the official wall of silence. Anonymous sources within the military provided fragments of information, requisition forms for unusual medical equipment, transport logs showing unmarked vehicle movements, communications records with unusual encryption. None of the documents proved anything definitively, but together they painted a picture of intense military activity during the period in question. Each leak brought renewed efforts at suppression. Security protocols were tightened. Personnel with access to sensitive files found themselves under increased surveillance. The military's response to the leaks revealed more than the leaks themselves. Organizations don't expend such energy protecting information they consider worthless. The town of Varginha itself became a laboratory for studying institutional denial. Local officials who initially acknowledged the strangeness of the events gradually modified their position. The mayor's office issued statements emphasizing Varginha's normalcy, its distance from superstition and sensationalism. Tourism officials worried that the town would become known for UFO stories rather than its coffee production and industrial base. Economic pressure joined military intimidation in creating a culture of enforced forgetting. Business owners who displayed UFO-related imagery in their windows received visits from concerned officials. The message was subtle but clear. Varginha's future depended on moving past this embarrassing episode. The Brazilian military's official position evolved through several stages. Initial responses were dismissive, with spokespeople suggesting the witnesses had seen ordinary animals or suffered from collective delusion. As evidence accumulated and researchers like Rodrigues and Paccaccini built increasingly detailed timelines, the denials became more specific. The military acknowledged responding to calls about unusual sightings, but insisted nothing extraordinary had been found. They confirmed the deployment of troops, but characterized it as routine training exercises. Each admission came only after civilian researchers had already documented the facts, creating the impression of an organization constantly retreating to new defensive positions. The pattern extended to international observers. When foreign journalists and researchers attempted to investigate, they encountered bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to frustrate their efforts. Interview requests were denied or indefinitely postponed. Access to public records was delayed through procedural complications. Researchers who persisted found their visas questioned, their movements monitored. Brazil's military apparatus, despite operating within a democratic framework in the mid-90s, demonstrated capabilities more commonly associated with authoritarian regimes. The contradiction was notable. A government that proclaimed transparency while deploying sophisticated suppression techniques. Hospital records became a particular focus of controversy. Researchers attempting to access files related to the treatment of unusual patients during January of 1996 encountered systematic obstruction. Records that should have been routine were classified as medical privacy protected. Even family members of patients who had been present during key moments found their access restricted in unusual ways. When pressed, hospital administrators cited regulations and policies, but their discomfort suggested external pressure. Nurses who had been friendly with local residents suddenly refused to discuss anything related to their work. The culture of silence extended throughout the institution, creating an informational void where detailed records should have existed. The toll on individual witnesses cannot be overstated. People who had lived ordinary lives suddenly found themselves entangled in something far beyond their control. Some embraced their role as witnesses, accepting the complications that came with telling their stories. Others retreated into denial that mirrored the official position, perhaps finding it easier to convince themselves they had been mistaken than to live with the constant pressure and fear. Families divided over whether to speak or remain silent. Friendships ended over disagreements about what had really happened. The social fabric of Varginha developed tears that would never fully heal. Years passed, and the suppression continued. Rodrigues and Paccaccini published their findings, compiled witness testimonies into books, and presented their evidence to anyone who would listen. Their work created a permanent record that prevented the incident from being completely erased from history. But the official position never wavered. The military maintained its denials with the patience of an institution that understands time is its ally. Witnesses grow old, memories fade, public interest moves to new mysteries. The strategy of denial through attrition proved remarkably effective. The Varginha case stands as a textbook example of how modern institutions manage uncomfortable truths. The techniques employed revealed sophisticated understanding of information control. Scatter the witnesses, intimidate those who remain, control the physical evidence, maintain plausible deniability while making access to verification impossible. The Brazilian military's approach suggested experience with such operations, raising questions about what other events might have been similarly managed. If such extensive resources were deployed to suppress information about Varginha, what else might lie hidden in classified files and sealed archives? 27 years have passed since that January day in Varginha. 27 years of questions that have never been answered, of witnesses who have never recanted, of a silence from official sources that speaks louder than any denial ever could. Not a single creature body has ever been produced for public examination. Not one official has stepped forward to confirm what happened in those chaotic hours. Yet ask Lilian Silva to describe what she saw in that vacant lot, and her voice still trembles with the same certainty it held in 1996. Ask the firefighters who responded that afternoon, and those willing to speak still maintain their stories with unwavering consistency. Ask the military personnel who were there, and you'll be met with either silence or carefully rehearsed denials that somehow ring hollow after all these years. This case refuses to fade into the comfortable territory of conspiracy theory and speculation because of what makes it fundamentally different from typical UFO reports. These were not distant lights in the night sky, blurry photographs that could be anything, or third-hand stories passed through unreliable chains of witnesses. This was multiple credible witnesses in broad daylight. This was physical interaction, people close enough to smell these creatures, to see the texture of their skin, to watch them breathe. This was a death that remains unexplained, a young man in perfect health who touched something and died within days. What exactly fell from the sky over Varginha that January morning? Where are those creatures now, if they ever existed? What killed Marco Eli Chereze just 3 days after his encounter? And perhaps most haunting of all, why would authorities deploy such extreme measures to hide the truth if there was no truth to hide? The rain still falls on Varginha, washing through the same streets where military trucks rolled that day, pooling in the vacant lot where 3 girls saw something impossible. Rain washes away evidence, dilutes traces, erodes certainty. But it has never erased the memories of those who saw what they saw, who know what they know, and who carry the weight of that knowledge still. Something happened in Varginha. The witnesses know it. The silence confirms it. And the mystery remains, unanswered and unsolved, waiting in the rain. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.